What if everything you were ever taught about the ancient world was only half the story, and the other half was lying silently on the ocean floor, waiting for someone brave enough to dive down and find it? History, as most of us learned it in school, happens on land. Civilizations rise on hilltops and river banks. Empires build their monuments on solid ground. Cities grow upward toward the sky, not downward into the sea. We learn about Rome and Athens and Babylon and Cairo, places that can be visited, photographed, walked through, and touched. We learn about history as something that leaves traces above the waterline, something that survives in libraries and museums and crumbling stone walls and ancient pottery shards sitting in glass cases under careful lighting. History is something we can reach out and touch. But the ocean has its own history. A deeper, older, stranger history that nobody taught in school because nobody fully knew it existed. Beneath the waves, in the cold silence of the seafloor, lie the ruins of worlds that once stood in full sunlight. Cities where people woke up in the morning, cooked their food, raised their children, argued in marketplaces, prayed in temples, and went to sleep at night without the faintest idea that one day the sea would swallow everything they had ever built and hold it in the dark for thousands of years, waiting for a diver's torch to find it again. This is the story of how divers found one of those lost worlds, and what it told us about a chapter of human history that had been sitting underwater for so long that most people had stopped believing it was real. To understand why entire cities end up on the ocean floor, you have to understand something about the relationship between land and sea that most people never think about. The boundary between ocean and shore is not fixed. It never has been. Sea levels rise and fall dramatically over geological time, driven by ice ages, tectonic movement, volcanic activity, and the slow rhythmic breathing of the Earth's own interior. During the last great ice age, which peaked roughly 20,000 years ago, so much of the world's water was locked up in enormous ice sheets covering much of the northern hemisphere that global sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than they are today. The coastlines of every continent on Earth looked completely different. Vast areas of land that are now beneath the ocean were then dry, fertile, and in many cases inhabited by human beings. As the Ice Age ended and the great ice sheets began their slow retreat around 12,000 years ago, the meltwater poured into the oceans in quantities almost impossible to imagine. Sea levels rose, not all at once, but steadily, over thousands of years, drowning coastlines that had been home to human settlements, fishing communities, trading ports, and in some cases entire civilizations. The people living on those coasts would have experienced the encroachment of the sea as a slow but unstoppable catastrophe, watching the waterline creep higher season by season, abandoning houses, and then villages, and then whole stretches of coast as the ocean swallowed them. Some researchers believe that this slow, millennia-long inundation of familiar coastlines is the origin of the great flood myths found in almost every culture on Earth, the memory of rising waters encoded in story and myth and religion, passed down through 100 generations until it became legend. The most famous of all the underwater city discoveries began not with a diver but with a fisherman, an afternoon of curiosity, and a set of ruins that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The story takes place off the coast of the Egyptian city of Alexandria, in the warm blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea, where the ancient city of Thonis Heracleion once stood at the mouth of the Nile Delta. In ancient times, Thonis Heracleion was one of the most important cities in the entire Mediterranean world, a bustling, wealthy, cosmopolitan port city where Egyptian, Greek, and Phoenician merchants traded goods from 3 continents, where enormous temples rose beside the water, where the great god Amun was worshipped in a sanctuary so magnificent that it drew pilgrims from across the ancient world. The city flourished for roughly 1,000 years, from around the 8th century BC to the 8th century AD. Ancient writers mentioned it. Greek historians described it. Trading records referenced its port. And then, sometime around the 8th century AD, the references simply stopped. The city disappeared from history. For over 1,000 years, Thonis Heracleion was considered lost, assumed by most historians to have been gradually abandoned or perhaps simply swallowed by the shifting delta of the Nile. Its exact location was unknown. Its ruins had never been found. It existed primarily as a name in ancient texts, a footnote in the history of the ancient Mediterranean world, a city that history had simply mislaid. Then, in 2000, a French underwater archaeologist named Frank Godiot was conducting a survey of the seabed in Abu Qir Bay, about 30 kilometers northeast of Alexandria, at depths ranging from 10 to 30 feet. Godiot had been working in the bay for several years, using sophisticated sonar equipment and sub-bottom profilers to map what lay beneath the silt on the seafloor. The equipment had been picking up anomalies, unusual density readings, shapes that didn't match natural rock formations, lines that were too straight and too regular to be anything other than man-made. Godiot and his team of divers descended to investigate. What they found in the murky shallow water beneath Abu Qir Bay was extraordinary beyond any expectation. Emerging from the silt and sand of the seafloor were the unmistakable remains of a massive ancient city. Enormous stone columns, some of them still standing upright on the seafloor, others lying toppled and encrusted with coral, stretched in rows that clearly marked the outlines of once grand buildings. Colossal statues lay scattered across the bottom. A massive statue of the god Hapi, deity of the Nile floods, measuring over 5 meters tall, lay on its side in the silt, its carved features still astonishingly detailed despite more than 1,000 years of submersion. A huge pink granite statue of a Ptolemaic queen lay nearby, its graceful form perfectly preserved by the cold and the silt that had covered it. Dozens of smaller statues of gods and pharaohs and royal figures were clustered around what had clearly been the entrance to a major temple complex. Then the divers found something that made everyone catch their breath. A large stone slab lying on the seafloor, covered in ancient inscriptions, a stele, a carved stone monument, bearing writing in both ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian. When the inscriptions were carefully cleaned and translated, they confirmed beyond any doubt what Godiot and his team had found. The text named the city. This was Thonis Heracleion. The lost city was lost no more. Over the years that followed, the excavation of Thonis Heracleion became one of the most remarkable archaeological projects in the world. Godiot's team, working with the Oxford Centre for Maritime Archaeology and the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, returned to the site season after season, spending hundreds of hours underwater carefully uncovering, documenting, and recovering artifacts from the seafloor. What they found painted a vivid and deeply human picture of a city that had once been magnificently alive. They recovered over 700 ancient anchors from the harbour area alone, evidence of the enormous volume of maritime trade that had passed through the city during its centuries of operation. They found hundreds of small bronze coins, gold jewellery, and intricate amulets that had once been offerings left by pilgrims at the Great Temple of Amun. They found enormous ceramic storage jars still sealed with their original contents. They found bronze weights used by merchants to measure goods in the marketplace. They found oil lamps, cooking vessels, children's toys. Each object was a fragment of an ordinary life, evidence that this was not just an abstract historical location but a real place where real people had lived their complicated, textured, entirely human lives. A merchant counting his coins. A mother buying oil for her lamp. A child losing a toy near the waterfront. A pilgrim leaving an amulet at the temple and whispering a prayer for safe passage across the sea. These lives had been submerged for over 1,000 years, preserved in the cold and the silt, waiting to be seen again. But why had the city sunk? The answer, when it emerged from the geological and archaeological evidence, was a combination of factors that painted a grim picture of ancient urban disaster. Thonis Heracleion had been built on a series of low-lying islands and sandbanks at the mouth of the Nile Delta, a location that offered superb access for maritime trade but was geologically precarious in ways that its builders perhaps did not fully appreciate. The sediments beneath the city were water-saturated and relatively unstable. Over centuries, the enormous weight of the city's buildings, its temples, warehouses, harbour walls, and residential districts, gradually compressed and destabilized the sediment below. Ancient earthquake activity in the region added additional stress to the already weakened ground. And as the sea levels of the Mediterranean rose slowly but steadily over centuries, the low-lying islands on which the city stood became increasingly vulnerable. At some point, possibly triggered by a significant earthquake or a combination of rising water and collapsing sediment, large sections of the city simply liquefied and slid into the sea. A geological process called liquefaction, where saturated sediment loses its solidity and behaves like a liquid under shock or sustained pressure. The city did not drown gradually. It went quickly. and what went quickly was preserved remarkably well, because the buildings, statues, and objects that sank into the soft silt of the seafloor were cushioned by that same silt, protected from the physical erosion that destroys things left exposed on land, and preserved in a cool, dark, oxygen-poor environment that slowed the decay of organic materials and kept metal objects from corroding as rapidly as they would have in the open air. The sea had swallowed the city, but it had also, in its way, kept it safe. Thonis Heracleion is perhaps the most dramatic and thoroughly documented of the world's underwater city discoveries, but it is far from alone. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, divers and sonar surveys have revealed what appears to be a massive submerged settlement at depths of around 130 feet. A site stretching over 5 miles that contains what researchers believe are the remains of urban structures, including what may be walls, roads, and building foundations, potentially dating back over 9,000 years. If the dating is accurate, the Gulf of Kambat site could represent one of the oldest urban settlements ever discovered anywhere on Earth. A city built at a time when the area was dry land during the lower sea levels of the post-Ice Age world, gradually submerged as the oceans rose. Off the coast of Greece, divers exploring the waters around the Aegean island of Pavlopetri have documented one of the best-preserved underwater Bronze Age towns ever found. A settlement that dates back at least 3,500 years, with clearly defined streets, courtyard buildings, public spaces, and what appears to have been a planned urban layout. The town was occupied during the period of the Mycenaean civilization, the same culture that produced the legends of Troy, the Trojan War, and Homer's Odyssey, and it appears to have been submerged by a combination of rising sea levels and local earthquake activity sometime around 1000 BC. Walking the streets of Pavlopetri, or rather, diving them, feels like stepping directly into the world of ancient Greece before it became ancient, when those streets were dusty and loud and alive with the voices of people going about their daily lives under a Mediterranean sun. And off the coast of Cuba, in waters far deeper than any of these Mediterranean sites, at depths of between 1,900 and 2,400 feet, a Canadian exploration company conducting a sonar survey in 2001 recorded what appeared to be a series of geometrically regular structures on the seafloor. The sonar images showed what looked like large stone blocks arranged in precise patterns, pyramidal structures, and what might have been roads or causeways, all at depths suggesting the site had been submerged for an extraordinarily long time, potentially tens of thousands of years. The site has never been fully investigated and remains deeply controversial. Some researchers believe the formations are entirely natural geological features, while others argue that their regularity and arrangement cannot be explained by natural processes alone. The truth about the Cuban underwater structures remains, for now, one of the most tantalizing open questions in underwater archaeology. What all these discoveries share, from the magnificent temples of Thonis Heracleion lying in Egyptian silt to the Bronze Age streets of Pavlopetri to the disputed structures off the Cuban coast, is the same fundamental revelation. The history of human civilization that we know, the history recorded in textbooks and museum exhibits and academic papers, is the history of the dry world. It is the story of the roughly 30% of Earth's surface that stays above the waterline. But human beings have been living, building, trading, praying, and loving on the other 70% too, or rather, on land that is now covered by the other 70%, drowned by the slow rise of the sea over the past 12,000 years as the world warmed from the last ice age. The true scope of human prehistory, the full story of how our species spread across the Earth, built its first settlements, developed its first agriculture, founded its first cities, may be largely submerged. The coastlines of 20,000 years ago, where early humans would naturally have clustered for food, water, and trade, are now hundreds of feet beneath the ocean surface. The settlements they built on those ancient coasts, the fishing villages and trading posts and early urban centers of the late Stone Age world, may be lying on continental shelves around the world, covered in silt and coral and the slow accumulation of 10,000 years of ocean sediment, waiting for the sonar and the dive lights and the careful brushes of underwater archaeologists to find them. Frank Goddio, the man who found Thonis Heracleion, has said in interviews that the ocean floor is the greatest archaeological site on Earth. Larger than all the land sites combined, largely unexplored, and full of the kind of preservation conditions that archaeologists on land can only dream about. Organic materials that would rot within decades on land can survive for centuries or millennia in the cold, dark, low-oxygen environment of the deep seafloor. Wooden ships. Leather sandals. Woven cloth. The physical fabric of ancient daily life, gone from the land record but potentially surviving on the ocean floor. The lost city found by divers is not a single place. It is not only Thonis Heraclean or Pavlopetri or the submerged settlements of the Gulf of Kambat. It is the entire submerged world, the drowned history of our species, the half of the human story that the sea took and the sea kept, and the sea is only now, very slowly and very grudgingly, beginning to give back. Every dive is a conversation with the past. Every artifact lifted carefully from the seafloor is a human voice reaching across 1,000 years of silence. Every city found beneath the waves is a reminder that the history we know is only a fragment of the history that was, and that the greatest library of human experience ever assembled is not in a building on land but in the cold, dark, patient, endlessly generous keeping of the sea. The water took these cities. But it also saved them. And one by one, in the hands of patient and passionate people willing to go deep enough and look carefully enough, they are coming back to the light.